Okay. Okay, I spent long enough trying to have the music play along with this. I don't know. It's uncooperative today, I guess. Let's see. I got 2 cameras going here. We'll see how this works. Okay. I live in the Erie Canal National Historic Corridor. And the canal used to run by the house out here. So Pup, being the man of the antique world, getting around like he does, he found this from a Society of the Erie Canal, 1939. Just a little booklet they used to put out often. Now I gotta find these. I gotta read more. I must have more of these. And they're right here in Albion, New York, is where they were made. Of course, it's about the Erie Canal. But I'd like to read it to you. You know, I don't know any other way to share it. Okay, so I'm going to read it to you, and we're reading and we're talking about back in the days when the Erie Canal ran. And there's some pretty neat stuff in here that we didn't, you think about it. Okay. Little tea with honey. Fake honey. Okay. The 6-hour evening trick for the Erie Canal mules ended at midnight. And in the wakeful summer nights, farmers dwelling not too remote from the towpath were roused by the steersman's call, "Look for a post!" There were stakes along the towpath at frequent intervals, and that welcome hail to the hoggy, who was the driver, would lose little time in halting his team and looping the sagging tow rope around one of those stakes. The boat, meanwhile, had been brought in and close to the shore, and the plank bridge swung over the bank, over the fresh mules and the sweating team they were to replace, and they were driven. The rustics never linked romance with the Erie Canal. To them, the canalers seemed a surely cheerless tribe of dull-eyed from long contemplation of the muddy water and the dusty towpath, the galled rumps of their mules, and the waterway was just a convenient place to dump rubbish, including the dead and inedible animals. Always its sluggish current bore eastward the bloated corpses of cats and dogs, and even an occasional horse, from which the hide had been stripped. Okay, hold on 1 second. You get the idea of it. The canal seemed to have been a convenient place to dump out things in those days. Okay, this is going to help me a lot. Okay. Okay. The Erie Canal dramatically vanished. Hordes of chattering Calabrians toiled beside the contractor's dredges to make a deeper, wider gash across the flank of New York State. The new bridges were built. Their attributes on the very edge of the water, so that no mule, unless he were amphibious, could use the towpath anymore. The new proud era of steam had arrived. The unromantic Republicans at Albany rechristened the historical ditch the Barge Canal. Few barges use it now. Lock tenders and lift bridge operators lead almost hermit lives, and the ranks and weeds crowd down the edges of the water, and almost as rankly grow the legends and yarns concerning the vanished race of canalers. Apparently, adventure and excitement walked with every mule driver, lurking in the company of typhoid germs in every drop of the Erie water. A year ago, a research division of the Society for the Erie Canal unearthed a WPA squad. A man who claimed to be one of the ancient mariners of the Erie, Captain Link. All surviving Erie boatmen are captains, even though Their original crew consisted of only 2 harnessed, scarred mules that was willing to walk and eager to talk about their early career. Indeed, after a couple of long beers at Spike's Galloway's saloon, the research division had great difficulty in stopping him. And here is a concentrated sampling of the things he told. Now, this was a captain of a canal barge. I bet if you took a mule's consensus around the country, you'd find that most of the old canal mules are still alive. Mule don't grow old. And where did you get that idea that a mule is slow? Let me tell you about my mule Agnes. She had a U.S. brand on her flanks, so she was probably a veteran of the Civil War. And she had hauled guns through Georgia for Sherman, and I drove Agnes from Buffalo to Albany and back again. And I don't remember how many years until she had tuggles on her backside, bigger than soup plates. Then I sold her to a farmer up in Genesee Valley. He paid me $5 for her. He figured maybe he could do a little light work for a few months, maybe. Some of the rich farmers up in the valley used to have fox hunts, and one day the hounds came right by Agnes' pasture. Well, sir, Agnes just laid back her ears and took off after those hounds. And when the fox was cornered, Agnes was there first. And after that, you just couldn't hold Agnes when you heard the dogs yip. The farmers' kids took to riding her, and they got so many fox trails for getting there first that the Tony hunters began to complain about it. But the farmer told them that if they wanted to hunt over his lands, they just have to put up with Agnes, sailing over fences like a kangaroo, with a kid's rugged, ragged overalls hanging on her back. So for Agnes, Erie Canal was a grand place for fishing back in the 70s, especially in the spring when the big pike and sturgeon came from Lake Erie. And lots of times the captain wouldn't let the boys drop a line in the canal unless the boat was tied up. And remember once, I had a blacksmith make me a hook out of a crowbar, and I put it on the length of an old tow rope, and I baited it with a young pig, dropped it into the canal, and up near Medina, we were headed for Rochester with a load of barley. One of those Lake Erie sturgeon grabbed the hook and hauled us back nearly to Lockport before we could get a rope out and snub it around the abutment of a bridge. Nearly pulled 3 mules into the canal. And for weeks after that, we had to harness those mules with their heads facing the boat. They was so used to going backwards, I'd had my teeth wrapped around my ears. Sure, if I hadn't been. We sold the sturgeon to a boatman that was headed west. He just put the mules in their stalls and let the sturgeon haul him. The only trouble was that he was just figuring on going to Buffalo. But the sturgeon wouldn't stop there, and he ended up in Detroit. He sold the sturgeon for 5 cents a pound and got enough to hire a side-wheeler tug to take him back to Buffalo, Breakwater. How's that? Well, that's one thing I always forgot to ask him. I never did find out how he got his boat and sturgeon through the locks at Lockport. Every once in a while, the bank of the canal would let go and flood the low country along the Erie. And sometimes I used to think it was fishermen that blew up the bank so they could have plenty of fish. Once I think it was 1857, where I was just a kid, and there was a break 2 miles this side of Albion, and the farmers on the north side of the canal didn't have very good wheat crops that year because of their seed was pretty well washed out. But they did have a lot of very nice pike to eat. They came along with wagons after the water had drained off, and they pitchforked the fish into them by the ton. They took them home and salted them and smoked them. There was a fellow from Albion named O'Brien. He had heard about some fish. He was about to break when he came down with a gunny sack to pick up some fish. When he got there wasn't nothing but bullheads left. So he filled the bag with bullheads and swung it up over his shoulder, and about 40 of those bullheads drove their stingers into his back. The yell he let out scared the children for miles around, and he lit out for Albion along the towpath, screaming at every jump. But he kept hold of the sack, and every step a new bullhead spike would jab into him, and every jab he'd go faster. They still claim that nobody nor nothing ever traveled any faster until they invented airplanes. Okay. Those breaks in the bank were mighty troublesome when your boat was near one of them. And the first thing you'd know is your boat would be bogged down in the corn lot, and your mules would be up there in the elm tree. I never does an elm tree any good to chop it down to salvage a team of mules. Generally, I wouldn't do the mules any good either. The farmers used to put in claims against the state when a break washed out their crops. And you'd be surprised at the good crops there I always was in them flooded fields. One of the biggest claims I ever heard of, though, wasn't a crop at all. It was just an old wooden privy that had maybe 15 cents worth of hemlock boards in it. But the man who owned it, he lived near Bushnell Basin, north of where the Big Phil goes, over into the Irondequoit Valley. He said it was worth $2,000 to him. And he got it, too. And he sold the farm tools and wagons, and most of his customers that didn't pay cash. He told the court of claims that he had been going out to his privy every morning after breakfast, and he'd sit there and think over the day before his business, and he'd get to take a pencil and write down inside on the door who owed him money and how much. It was his bookkeeping system. Then the break came. The water washed his privy down the creek and smashed it into kindlewood, and all of his records were gone. He claimed he had at least $2,000 owing him that he would never collect it now, with no scrap of writing to tell him who owed him what. It was hardly any trouble at all for the canalers to get into trouble with people living along the canal. I used to have a boat named Cleopatra O'Leary. It was a boat especially for hauling grain. It was a nice, tight, clean boat, tied up at a fancher one winter, and there was a farmer there who was pretty near crazy. He had gone into the vinegar business, and he had bought tons of apples. There they were piled up around his new mill. He couldn't start grinding until he got hold of some barrels. I felt sorry for him, and I told him he could run the cider right into the Cleopatra O'Leary and then pump it out again in the spring. It wasn't far, just a couple of 100 feet from the mill into the boat. And I figured the cider would keep the timbers tight, and I wouldn't have to send her to the dry dock in the spring. Besides, he told me if I let him use the boat, I could have all the cider I could drink. Okay. Good idea, huh? So this fellow built a plank flume from the mill to the boat, and the cider started to pour in. It came for days and days until the boat was right full of them, right up to the hatches. Then he rented his neighbor's cistern and filled that up with cider, too. She started to work when the foam boiled out over the hatches and over the deck and down into the canal. There was still some water left and quite a few fish, and it was a sight, I tell you, to see the big bass and the carp staggering around that shallow water. All the tomcats and fancher would be easy pickings. But they soon found out different. A carp is generally pretty shy and it minds its own business. But a carp with a hard cider hangover is something else again. And they chased those cats to hell and gone. For years after that, fancher cats wouldn't even eat canned salmon. They was nervous around fish. Drunk fish. I rigged up my bilge pump. Now and then I'd pump myself a dipper of cider. We had a mild December, and the stuff kept working. Then about New Year's, the big freeze came on, and how it froze. Maybe you don't know it, but hard cider doesn't freeze. It won't freeze solid like water, but makes a sort of mush. So you wasn't worrying about my boat bursting. I wasn't worrying about my boat bursting, but the pump kept clogging up, and it kept poking around until I'd find a place where it wasn't frozen into the slush. I found out it was right in the middle of the boat. Then I found out something else. It was just the water in the cider that was freezing, and all the alcohol from the whole boatload was being squeezed into a little space in the center where the pump was. And by the middle of February, I was getting 120 proof Applejack out with a pump. I never did have such a time as I did that winter. I lived high, too. I could swap a jug of Applejack any time for a ham or a couple of fat roosters. Then spring come, and the farmer got some barrels together and started to pump the cider out of the boat and let it turn to vinegar. But I drunk all the power out of the stuff, and all he had was a hell of a lot of sour water. He just couldn't figure it out. At least he couldn't until the water had come into the canal again, and I was on my way. I had to paint a new name on the Cleopatra Leary, and I was still trying, to go through the fancher after dark. He's probably still laying there for me with shotgun. He just didn't seem to know the meaning of gratitude. Okay. This here captain was the most honest fella. I'm taking it. Okay. One year, the Public Works Commissioner got on the idea that there was a lot of land along the towpath going to waste. So he gets a fleet of owners together and sells them on the idea of using that land. So that the first half dozen of boats out of Buffalo that year take plows, and each plow had a furrow, and the mules haul the boat along. Even the mules think it's a good idea because having a plow on driving a furrow on the side of a towpath takes a good part of the pull from the left rump. They plowed the strip of land from near Buffalo right down to Albany. And the next few boats took the job of rolling it and harrowing it. And then they hitched up one of those patent cedars and sowed 2 rows of corn from the end of the canal to the other end. Through the summer, the commissioner would send cultivator along those rows, and they were fertilized with mule manure. And the corn grew tall and handsome. And the farmers all over the state got pretty mad because the state was competing with them for the corn market. There was talk of trampling down the whole canal and corn lot. But there was a boat along the canal every mile or so, and we could keep watch all of the line, and a few farmers got their ears bent for tampering with the corn. We didn't have any trouble, but it was such a chore harvesting that corn that we never did try it again, because a man can't properly drive his mules and shuck corn and toss it into the boat at the same time. So after that, commissioner decided to plant clover along the canal. And he sent every skipper along with a bag of clover seed. We mix the seed with the feed for the mules. And the clover seed is so tough it can go through a mule's bowels and then without hurting it any. And then we'd clean out the stables and we'd throw a few pitchforks full over the shore, onto the shore. That's why the canal still has sweet clover growing along the banks. That was one of the good deeds we done for the farmer that was never appreciated. For more than 50 years, their bees have been gathering honey from them clover blossoms. And I bet none of them ever realize when they smear honey on their wheat cakes how much they owe them mule-digested clover seeds. There was one canaler who tried to raise bees on his boat. He kept track of what the farmers was planting, buckwheat, where was good and standing in the basswood trees, so he would get his bees there for the honey flow. But 3 of his hives chanced to swarm one day when they was being put through the Clover Street locks in Pittsford. And when the lock tenders got back from where they went and took their own whiffletrees and persuaded him that he ought to sell his bees and take up with some other form of livestock, he had a brand new 1.5-inch tow rope too, and his mules strained so hard to get away from the bees and stretched that rope so much that you could have used it for a binder twine. Okay. There was a big passenger business in the Erie Canal. Okay. So you get the idea of what this is. I think I'm going to give you a chance to decide if you'd like to hear any more. And if you'd like to hear any more, then let me know, and I will read it to you. There's a couple more pages. Look for a post! Thank you for coming along and taking a little ride with me down the old Erie Canal. I'm Captain Theo.